too. I'm James Shore. I have been practicing Agile for over 20 years. I got started with extreme programming, actually feature-driven development in 1999, and then quickly moved into extreme programming in 2000. Had a wonderful experience with it and have been basically practicing Agile with a strong XP flavor ever since. And along the way, I wrote a book. It's called The Art of Agile Development. It is now available in a second edition. This one has a goldfish on the cover. That's how you know it's good. You get the one with the goldfish. It actually, in all seriousness, I think this is basically a ground up rewrite of the first edition. I think it's really good. So check it out. So I have been helping Agile teams scale for over 13 years. And I'm here to tell you about the most promising approach to scaling I have yet seen. And that is FAST, fluid scaling technology. Please ask questions as we go. If I just do nothing but talk straight through, we've got about 45, 50 minutes of stuff. But this is a topic that I think people have a lot of interest in. When I talk about it, people have a lot of questions. So just as questions come to you, raise your hand in Zoom, and I would like to answer them as we go. I think it'll be more interesting that way. It's hard for me to keep track of the chat while I'm giving a talk. So Pepe, if you see something interesting coming along, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand and just letting me know verbally so I can address it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That would be great. Okay, so let's start out by talking about what scaling is. I define scaling as, let me focus here, is increasing the number of people working on a set of related products or code bases. As a result, you end up with multiple interdependent teams. So if you have 1,000 teams in a really big organization and they're all in different divisions, all on working on different things, that's not scaling. That's not a scaling challenge. It's a really big organization, and that leads its own challenges, but that's not a scaling problem in the way that I'm talking about. On the other hand, if you have multiple teams, even just 2 teams working on the same product, or 10 or 20 or 100, now you've got a scaling challenge. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about scaling. And this is important because, of course, when you're talking about how to deliver faster, the #1 best way to deliver faster is, survey says, to reduce scope. Yeah, if you want to deliver faster, you want to cut stuff out so you can have less to do. But the #2 way to deliver faster is to eliminate waste in your process. Look for the stuff that you're doing and that you maybe don't need to do. A lot of predictability stuff that organizations demand fall into that category. #3 is improve your technical capability. And way, way, way down at the bottom of the list is adding people. So the real title of this talk is scaling, the last thing that you want to do. I'm joking, but sort of. People reach for adding people way too easily. It seems like an easy solution, but it has a lot of costs and it has a lot of challenges, and it can actually completely tank your ability to deliver. I've seen organizations that are just completely stalled out, and a big part of that is that they're dealing with all the communication problems that comes with scaling. They quite possibly could get more done with one really good team than they're getting done with lots of teams. Now, when I started my scaling work, the default was, and kind of still is, small component teams. That's where you've got each team focused on a technical component in a larger system. So the classic way is you'd have like a back-end team and a front-end team. And what that meant now is, of course, anything you wanted to deliver has to involve both teams. And even in a microservices world, people sort of tend to create these microservices as components that have to work together in order to accomplish anything of merit. So people would hire me because their organizations were grinding to a halt. For example, one organization I worked with, they had 40 teams. I'm going to be talking about them a lot today. They had 40 teams, and I did a value stream analysis. A value stream analysis is where you map out what happens as an idea goes from initial conception to actual realization as delivered software, and what are the steps and stages along the way, and particularly how much time is spent working and how much time is spent waiting. So I did a value stream analysis of some of the work being done by this company with 40 teams, and I found, I don't remember the details exactly, but it was something like 2 to 3 days of work over the course of several months of total cycle time. So they were spending the vast majority of their time waiting, as the idea, a little bit of work would be done by this team and then it'd be put on a queue for another team and wait for the team to get to it. And then they would do a little bit of work and they would go on another queue. I mean, 90% waste, 95% waste. It's really astounding, but it's also not uncommon. So these companies just get killed by their cross-team dependencies. And in addition, when you have a lot of dependencies between teams, errors tend to creep up in those cross-team boundaries. So you see a lot of errors in those places too. So here is a picture of the dependency graph for that organization. This is real. What you see here is the boxes, those are index cards, those are teams, and the lines are dependencies between the teams, where dependency is defined as, in order for our team to get work done, we need another team to do something for us first. And this, again, is not unusual. I mean, 40 teams is a pretty big set of teams. You've got, and there's lots of organizations that have tons of teams, but having them all work on the same product or set of products is less common to have so many teams. But even with the smaller groups, this is the kind of thing that I see. So basically what was happening was nearly everybody was depending on nearly everybody else. And that was because of that component team structure. So I helped them redesign their team responsibilities. We called them full ownership teams at the time. I've always called them full ownership teams. Some people call them feature teams. And lately, there's a book that's reached prominence called Team Topologies, and they call the same idea stream-aligned teams. So I helped them, as I always do, I worked with a cross-section. We identified sort of a cross-section of the organization who was going to work with me to identify how to redesign the teams. We did that work, we rolled it out, and it worked. It resolved the bottlenecks. It allowed the company to keep growing. They got to 67 teams before they started running into new problems. Most of them were actually around product management rather than bottlenecks between teams. But it still wasn't perfect. So a stream-aligned team is about a team that has full ownership of some aspect of the business. And in team topologies, they say that each team focuses on a continuous flow of work that's aligned to a business domain or organizational capability. And this does work really well, but it's not perfect. In particular, it can be quite hard to incorporate specialties. In this organization, we had about 10 user experience folks. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was about 10. We had 3 security folks, if I remember correctly, and we had 40 teams. Now, arguably, we needed to hire more people, right? We needed more user experience folks and more security folks, but that kind of ratio is not atypical in my experience. Also, if you want your teams to be 5 to 7 people, it's hard to have every specialty represented in every team. So the sort of classic, what I call horizontal scaling model is, it's really hard to create true cross-functional teams. They're also brittle to changing business strategy because over time, the needs of the organization change, but the teams are designed around the expectations of the business at the time the design is made. So we think that we need to spend X% of our effort on this thing, Y% of our effort on this thing, and we put people on those teams accordingly. But as those needs change, those teams need to grow and shrink. And shrinking isn't such of a problem until you get down to one person who's needed for that. And then you have to combine a couple of teams together. Similarly, as you grow, if you get past more than about 9 or 10 people on a team, you need to start splitting teams. And now that creates potential dependencies. So as the organization needs change and you want more or less people on various problems, your organizational design breaks down. Now, we knew that this was going to be an issue. So we said that the architectural team in the organization was going to be responsible for taking care of it, but they didn't. And I think that's because it's not something that you need to do every day. It's not even something you have to do every 3 months. Something you have to pay attention to once in a while. And as a result, the architecture team had lots of other stuff to do, and it just sort of fell off their radar. Additionally, it's expensive. The original design took months of both change management and getting everybody, on the same page around what we wanted to do. And I think as a result, there was really a lot of reluctance to try to go through anything related to that again.
Question. Can I ask a quick question? Yeah, this is Maggie. So when you say the architectural team, they were responsible for making sure the teams were comprised properly. When you said they were in control, architectural team was in charge of it.
Yeah. So we used something called the reverse Conway maneuver, where we tried to design a team organization that reflected the technical architecture that we wanted from our software, from the organization's software. So as a result, the architecture team was responsible for maintaining the structure, maintaining what the teams were responsible for, and working with management to redefine teams when necessary. Does that answer the question, Maggie?
Thanks. Yes.
Yeah. And if anybody else has questions, just use the raise hand button in Zoom, and I'll see it, and you won't have to jump in. I'm happy to pause when I see somebody raise their hand.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Another problem is that we've got lots of little teams, right? They're 5, 6, 7 people. They're all focused on a particular problem that they solve, and for the most part, they have full ownership of that problem, which is fantastic. But as a result, people tended to get kind of a tunnel vision. They were siloed, focused on their thing, and the big picture view kind of fell apart. Not saying that it fell apart in a bad way, but it was a point of contention where it was hard to get everybody necessarily rowing in the same direction. And product management was a continuing problem for this organization, I think because they had so many teams. We didn't have enough product managers for every team. And so we backfilled with something called technical product managers, but I don't think it worked very well. And then finally, although the cross-team dependencies were reduced, they were still a challenge. Every arrow in this graph is a dependency where one team depends on another team in order to finish their work. The other team has to do something in order for the first team to finish their work. And so we had a lot of questions about how and when to deal with dependencies. So although I had something that was working, and I'd used this with several organizations, and it was the best way of approaching scaling that I knew, it still wasn't perfect. And I was keeping my eye out for alternatives. And in 2019, I heard about FAST at the Agile Open Northwest conference. Ron Cortell and Paige Watson were giving a talk on it. And my first reaction was, this is brilliant. It gave me the same sense that I got when I first ran into extreme programming back in 2000, that there's something really fascinating and exciting going on here. My second reaction was the same as when I first heard about extreme programming, which is, I have no idea if this could possibly work, and this might just be a crazy, nutty idea. And my third reaction, also just like XP, was I have to try this. The reason I found this so interesting is that in the team topologies approach, what we're doing is we're scaling horizontally. we're trying to add more people by adding more teams, and we're keeping the teams as independent and autonomous as possible. But this requires really careful design. When I do this, I have to create a change team composed of sort of representative sample of the organization. And then we go off and we work for weeks, often months, to figure out how to make this all work and come up with the perfect design. It's centrally managed and then pushed onto the organization top down. And it's kind of a big bang approach. I could never figure out how to do it incrementally. Ron Cortell's approach with FAST is inspired by open space technology. It's self-organized and it's from the bottom up. And it's something that can be done incrementally. So it's much more in the spirit of Agile than this sort of top-down, centrally managed design all the teams approach is. And so that was really interesting to me. Also, I have experience with self-organization. As part of this effort that I would do with companies, we'd often end with a self-organization exercise where we've designed all the teams in collaboration with the business or with the company and the programmers and getting feedback. It's not completely, top down. But we end up with, these are the teams that we're going to have, and this is the constraints we have on what kind of skills we need on the teams and so forth. And then we have, when I can do it, and often I can, we have a self-organization exercise. What you see here in this picture is every table represents a team, and the big white balloons have team names on them. And people come into this room and they go look around and talk to everybody and each other, and they decide which team they're going to join by sitting at one of those tables. And it's done in multiple rounds, so people, so it's not musical chairs, and it's not, people can end up where they want to end up. And this has always been really powerful. This leads to teams that are excited to work together right from the beginning. So I knew that self-organization at the team level, self-organized teams could work. And I've also have experience with open space technologies such as Agile Open Northwest, which is an open space conference that is here in the US. And so I know that works really well too. Yamini, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Go ahead.
Yeah, you did. So I just have a quick question. So when we refer to teams here, the self-organized teams you're talking about, I'm not sure if it's too early to jump onto it. You can, if you're covering it later, that's fine. So the question I had was, when we say teams, are we talking like a Scrum team, or what is the model of teams? And are they working towards a specific goal, each team, or how are they structured? Can I know a little bit about the
Yeah, we're talking about sort of Scrum's teams. Each team, Scrum or XP teams, each team has a purpose that they are responsible for accomplishing. And so you might have a team that is, I don't want to give any real life examples because I want to protect some confidentiality, but you might have if your product is a web browser, you might have a team that's responsible for JavaScript, and you might have a team that's responsible for networking and a team that's responsible for rendering. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so feature-based teams. So that's fine. So, and when you say they can self-organize, are we expecting again, in Agile world, that's the actual expectation, but in reality, that's where we struggle with. Are these people, because they're self-organizing, are they kind of cross-skilled to handle any sort of work? How are we even positioning those people to go choose those teams? So is there some kind of prep work which is done before we go for this exercise? And like I said, if you're covering it later, that's fine if I'm jumping in too early. But I was just wondering how are they all microservice developers? Are they all kind of kind of full stack people? I'm just giving specific examples, but in general, are they cross-skilled to handle anything? How are these people able to self-organize?
Yeah, the things you're bringing up are the kinds of reactions I typically get when I talk about doing self-organization in these horizontally scaled efforts that I've done. And I apologize if I don't fully answer your question. I've got a really loud air conditioning in the background, so it's a little hard for me to hear you. But basically, to make this work in the classical scaling environment, not fast, but in the classical scaling environment, what we would do as part of the team design is we'd say, these are the skills that each team needs. And in order for the team to be viable, we need at least this many people. And as a whole, the team needs to have all these skills, X, Y, and Z. And you are welcome to join a team. If you want to learn, if you want to develop your skills in a new area, you're welcome to join a team that you don't have the skills to join, as long as other people on this team have all the skills necessary. And so part of the multiple rounds that we go through is we ask, are all the teams viable yet? And if they're not, people need to move around until they are. Does that answer your question, Yamini?
Yeah, that definitely does. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
But although I had a lot of success with this self-organization in this horizontal team environment, there was a lot of concern about it, particularly fear that people would get stuck, like that it's going to be sort of like being picked for dodgeball as a kid. Nobody's going to want me. People have trouble really grasping that, yes, you can join whatever team you want. Nobody gets to say no. And there's a fear that I'm going to join a team and I'm going to be stuck with it forever. So it always tended to lead to a lot of anxiety, which is another thing that I've seen with this sort of classic horizontal scaling approach, is that it requires a lot of change management work. So I came across FAST, and it is about self-organization. It's about applying open space ideas to scaling. And I've seen both of these things work, so I knew I had to try it. And then, well, 2 years went by. I talked about FAST. I kept saying, hey, I'd really like to try this. Anybody want to try it? No, crickets. There's nothing, nobody's biting. I even put it in my book. I mentioned it. I've never tried this, but it looks really promising. Here's something you might want to consider if you're, looking to be on the bleeding edge. But I didn't have a chance to try it. And then last year, I was asked to help a company move to a team-oriented way of working. They had people who were very much working in silos and individually, and they wanted them to work in teams. It was a big healthcare organization. They have over 100,000 employees, which sounds really impressive. And whenever people talk about how they've worked for big companies, they'll say things like this. I worked for a big healthcare organization with over 100,000 employees. But the reality is these big organizations are composed of lots of divisions. So I didn't work for the whole organization. I worked for one division of this organization, and they had 45 people. So just truth in advertising. They had 13 product managers and 24 engineers, which is a really interesting ratio. It's nearly 2 to 1 engineer to product, or 1 to 2 a product to engineering ratio. And that's because they did analytics, data analytics for their clinicians in hospitals. So this was a very, very technical domain, and the product managers were there to help provide some domain expertise and also to wrangle the many stakeholders that this relatively small organization had. So originally planning to do sort of a classic horizontal scaling approach, the team topology style, stream-aligned teams and so forth. For doing something radical. And then I saw this. This was something we created as part of the initial work. I did things the way I always did. We gathered a cross-section of the organization to do the design work as part of the change team, as also the change management. And as part of that, we identified all the products that the organization was responsible for. And keep in mind, this is 45 people in the organization, 24 engineers. Every little tiny sticker on that slide is a separate product. These circles are groups of products, and the lines are dependencies between products. And when I saw this, I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a challenge. It's going to be really hard to create a scaling design that actually can have fully autonomous teams where people can have full ownership. So I helped them design a horizontal scaling model. We continued forward. And yeah, what we created was rife with dependencies. We had 7 teams. Each of these stickies is a team. I've taken off the confidential information, so just the blank stickies each represent a team. And the arrows between them are dependencies. And remember, an arrow means that the team at the start of the arrow is depending, that one team depends on another team in order to do their work. So you're seeing a lot of dependencies here, and this is the best design we could come up with. Also, there were too many teams for their size. A lot of these teams were really, really tiny, and some of them were huge. One or two of them were really large. And additionally, their business, because they had so many stakeholders, because all those products had their own stakeholders, because they had so many stakeholders, their business priorities were constantly changing, and which meant that their needs for their teams would be constantly changing. They would constantly have to be reallocating people between teams. So it was a recipe for bottlenecks and stress, and it just didn't look like it was going to be a good situation. So I talked to them. I said, well, there's another alternative. We could go with a vertical scaling model where people self-select into teams according to their skills, interests, personal relationships, and what's right for the organization. And they looked at the options and they considered the pros and cons. And we spent quite a while looking at both choices, and eventually said, yeah, let's try a vertical scaling approach, which is, and FAST is an example of vertical scaling. So in horizontal scaling, what you're going to do is you're going to increase the number of people by adding teams, and you're going to make the teams as autonomous as possible so they can work independently. In a vertical scaling model, what you're doing is you're increasing the number of people that can work together as if they were a single team. And that's what's going on in FAST, is we actually can create what looks like a single team with 50, 60 people on the team. So let me explain more about FAST. In the words of the FAST guide, which you can find at fastguide.io or fastagile.io, FAST is a lightweight, simple to understand, and simple to master method for organizing people around work that scales. The main activity of FAST is, well, actually, let me back up. So at a high over level view of this is that you're going to bring everybody together to work as one tribe. That's what FAST calls as a tribe. I think that's a little twee. So we just called it the name of the division that we're in. But you bring everybody together as a single tribe. You visually represent your business goals on a wall. We were fully remote because of the pandemic, so we represented it on a Miro board. You let the tribe self-organize into teams to break down and do the work, and then on a short cadence, you synchronize and repeat that step again. Short cadence is shorter than most people expect. It's every 2 days. So twice a week, on Monday and on Thursday, we would get together to reorganize who's on which team. And Wednesdays were reserved for meetings and what we called sharpening the saw. So as part of this work, we moved all the standing meetings to Wednesday so that Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, Friday could be completely uninterrupted focused development time. So now you can have any cadence that you like. And one of the experiments the group tried at one point was switching to 1 week cycles, but they switched back to twice a week because they felt like 1 week was just too long, and they preferred the shorter cycle. So the main activity of FAST is the FAST meeting. Every 2 days, or on Monday and Thursday, we gather in a virtual room using Miro. And first, each team that is now disbanding or that has done their work in the past 2 days, summarize what's happened since the last FAST meeting. It's very brief. It's like a stand-up. Next, product manager reviews the organizational goals. In our case, it was one of the division's executives. Usually that hasn't changed much. But if a deliverable has been completed, there's probably something new that's coming up that's ready for people to start when the space is available for it. After that, people volunteer to lead teams, and that can be anybody in the tribe. Now, in our case, we said because we had so many product managers and because they were very used to sort of a command and control approach where product managers were in charge. We said that product managers couldn't lead a team, that it had to be an engineer, because we wanted to get people used to the idea of collectively owning the work and taking responsibility in that way. But in the way FAST is defined, anybody can lead a team. These people are called team stewards. And it's a temporary role. It only lasts until the next FAST meeting. So it's only for the next 2 days. Each steward writes on a sticky, this is what I want a team to work on. Typically, they're going to work on one of your deliverables, one of the features that you want to build or something that you're going to ship. But it can also involve important tasks that are not on the radar of the product managers. For example, build automation or refactoring. Anything that's important for the tribe to work on is something that one of these team stewards can say that their team is going to do. And then the rest of the folks choose teams that they want to work on, and they self-organize onto those teams. They do that based on their knowledge, their interests, their personalities, and the personalities of the people on the teams, so who they want to work with, and overall what's best for the organization. And then each team goes and works as they see fit. This FAST meeting is the bulk of what FAST is about, and it's very fast. It takes about 20 minutes, and there's no other ceremonies in FAST. Typically, I find that people have a lot of questions at this point, so I'm going to pause and ask, does this raise any questions for you? Yamini, go ahead.
So I get this point, like, I'm sorry if there's some background noise, I get the same AC issues. So the stewards, I understand they put up either a product goal or a tech debt kind of thing as what they want to accomplish, and teams choose what they want to do. I mean, the developers typically self-organize. But one question that came to my head is like, if it's in a short cadence of 2 days, I'm relating to Kanban, it's more like an incident management. It is possible we shift the people in just 2 days. But when it comes to an enhancement, let's take a typical example of a development, like we are developing a microservice or an API. It's not going to end something in a 2-day span. And how do you handle a seamless handoff when there is a shift of resources? Like, say I'm working on team A, and on the next FAST meeting, I'm choosing to work on team B. How is this handoff seamless if somebody else is going to work on that part? Or is it rather, if I'm working on a piece, we kind of have a working agreement, I finish that, there is no in-between handoff. So how is a working agreement, and how do you manage that seamlessly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that people were really concerned about, but it turns out not to be as much of an issue as you might expect. First off, something you kind of touched on, I just want to clarify. These 2-day cycles, we called them iterations, but I think that was a mistake because this organization had a history of using something that they called sprints. They weren't really, but they called them that. And there was a strong expectation that you would sign up for something at the beginning of the sprint and you would commit to delivering it at the end of the sprint. But that's not how FAST cycles work. It's the 2-day check-in the FAST meeting is just a check-in. There's not an expectation that you're starting and finishing something in that time. You're just making as much progress on it as you can. So you're right that you're not necessarily going to be done in a position to deliver something in 2 days. In fact, that's usually the case. But although we're reallocating to teams every FAST meeting, every cycle, the reality is that people tend to prefer to stick with the stuff that they're working on. They want to see it through to completion. So there isn't a whole lot of, well, there actually just has never been, the entire team is disbanding and a completely new set of people is working on it. Typically, the majority of the folks are providing a through line for that. And actually, in a moment, I'm going to show a picture. Because this was all done online, I actually have a recording of how people selected in every single FAST meeting for months. And I've turned 2 months of that into a diagram that shows how people moved around. And I'm going to share that with you in a moment. So does that answer your question, Yamini?
Okay, sorry about that. So that definitely answers. Just that, I'm curious to look at the diagram. It definitely helps with a lot of mature teams. The question were more towards, how do we handle when there is teams which are just forming phase. But definitely, I'm more interested to see the diagram you're talking about. But thanks for that.
There's another question from Bob. Bob, you're next.
Yeah, give me just a moment, Bob.
Okay, go ahead, James. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on the team forming question, team dynamics is something that we ran into trouble with. And I'm not sure how much of it's related to FAST and how much of it's related to the organization I was working with, but I want to talk about that a bit more, because if this is something you want to try for yourself, it's something to keep an eye on. So we'll come back to that. Thanks, Yamini. Bob, go ahead.
So, James, there's an episode of the Mob Mentality show where Joshua Kirvescu is being interviewed, and he sort of turns the tables on his interviewers and asks them, have you ever experienced this phenomenon where in the physical space, this is very easy to see, you're all in an open floor space, and this table has a team and that table has a team and so on. And at some point, a team at table X says, we really don't know how to do this, but I know George 2 tables over does. Can we borrow him for a few minutes or an hour or an afternoon? And in that sense, once that becomes part of the culture, it becomes a very fluid situation, but it's small borrowings that are reciprocated. So there's no angst around that. That same pattern was discovered by Industrial Logic, by Hunter Industries, and I can speak to the fact that it was discovered at Cengage Learning, where I was, because we did almost exactly the same thing. It's different terminology and it's different trigger mechanisms, but the end result is largely the same. It's borrowing and it's liquid.
Yeah, I think this approach to working together is something that is starting to we're starting to see a critical mass of experiences around it. Tim Ottinger and I have been tweeting about it back and forth to each other recently, and he's had a similar experience. Now his teams were using mobbing, and for this organization, although Ron Cortell, when he originally did this at his original organization, their teams were all mobbing as well. The organization I was working with was absolutely not interested in mobbing, so we never did any mob programming at all. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the challenges this organization had in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Maggie, go ahead.
I'm sorry if I missed this, but sort of circling back to the finished work or handing off work that wasn't complete. Did the team still have backlogs with broken down stories to work on and bugs to work on and finite definition of done and all that type of stuff?
Sort of. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. We use something called a discovery tree to track how much work was left to be done on a particular, what we called valuable increment, which is like a feature. But that wasn't owned by the team, that was owned by the organization. Now it did turn out, or by the division, by the tribe. Now it did turn out that for this group, each team tended to work on a separate valuable increment. They did not tend to have multiple teams working on the same valuable increment. But I think a healthier approach would have been to have more, fewer increments and more working together to get things done. Does that address what you were asking about, Maggie?
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Paul, go ahead.
Hi.
Paul, go ahead.
Hi, can I go ahead?
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My question is, how do you measure progress? So I know on XP teams, you can have the customer. On Scrum, you have like sprint demo and sprint goals, right? And then, you can also have like metrics around customer engagement with, DevOps or whatnot. In this specific case, I guess those are sort of independent concepts that maybe could apply here, but I'm curious to hear in your specific case and also in general what you think about that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here. Now, this is a continuous flow approach. It's not an iteration based approach. So there is no, we're signing up for this thing and we're committing to have it done in a week or 2 weeks. Instead, we are just making progress steadily with checkpoints every 2 days, excluding Wednesdays. So there was no predictions, no estimating of when things were going to be done. There was a technique, again, the discovery trees, that will show you that you can use to see sort of roughly as a progress bar what's left to be done, how far along we are and what's left to be done. So that's one part of the answer to that question. And then the other part of the answer to the question, which is how do we work with our stakeholders to make sure they're getting what they want? That was something that in theory, everybody should be thinking about, but mostly the product managers were thinking about. And there was a whole body of work that I did with them around defining purpose, your vision, your mission tests. How do you break that down into valuable increments that can be delivered independently? That can be done with any style of organization. And so I'm not talking about it in this talk, but that's what we did. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let me show you, this may help clear up some questions and it may raise additional questions. I want to show you go into more detail about how this worked in practice. So the animation I showed you previously was sort of an abstract animation of how it's meant to work. What I'm going to show you here is our actual Miro board that we used for the FAST meeting. So when people come into the FAST meeting, they would see the previous iteration here. And remember, the first thing we do after people gather is each team steward would sort of summarize what their team did in the past couple of days. And this was, again, just a sentence or two. It's just so everybody knows what's going on. This is what it looks like. And then the bulk of the work happens down here, which is the current iteration. Now, in that current iteration section, we had our working agreements, the business priorities, the teams, and a bunch of stickies. And when you come into this, all these orange stickies have one orange sticky for every person on the team, and each orange sticky has a name on it. So you can find your sticky with your name on it. And so when we're talking about people volunteering or self-organized or moving, what they're doing is they're moving their sticky. Now, in an in-person environment, they would move their bodies, but in a virtual environment, they move their sticky. So it starts out with all the orange stickies over here on the right. And then when somebody volunteers to be a steward, they slide their sticky into the little steward square of one of the teams, which is going to be blank to start with. And then when we say, okay, everybody join a team that you want to join, everybody would just move their stickies onto a team. This is a anonymized version of what the team area of the Miro board looked like. What you see here is, I don't know if you all can see my mouse pointer or not. This is the team focus. What is the team going to work on? And the steward describes that when they volunteer to lead a team. This is the valuable increment that the team is going to work on. Small maintenance, I'll explain in a moment. And these are the team members who are going to be on the team. Again, people would drag their sticky, when they volunteered to steward a team, they would drag their sticky into the steward box, write a yellow sticky and explain it out loud to the group. And then everybody else would move their stickies into the team members box, according to which team they wanted to join. Now, the environment we were in was overcomplicated, complicated by a number of factors I'll explain in a moment. So I wouldn't necessarily use this as a template if you're interested in using FAST for yourself. In particular, there's two things in this picture that I wouldn't do by default. first off, because the organization had so many products, so many stakeholders, the valuable increments were really, really small. And so they were working on a lot of valuable increments at a time. I would prefer the team, the tribe as a whole, to focus on just one or two things at a time, in which case you don't need a special entry for this is the valuable increment we're working on. In addition, the organization prior to us introducing FAST was extremely siloed. People would just work, everybody had their own thing that they worked on. Each product manager had their own sponsor or stakeholders that they worked with, and the engineers would report to particular product managers. And so there were maintenance things, and there wasn't a lot of automation. So there was a lot of maintenance that just had to be done to keep the lights on that only one person would know how to do. So after the team self-organized, product manager would say, well, this is some small maintenance that needs to be done in the next couple of days, and I'm going to put that on the team with a person who knows how to do that thing. And that's what this small maintenance box was for. This section here that I'm showing on screen is what the business priorities section looked like. Now, as I've alluded to, we had a lot of challenges in the organization. That we had that large ratio of PMs to engineers. We had kind of a rule-oriented thinking rather than, hey, let's work off of a sort of fundamental philosophy and principles and work things out when they come up. There was a lot of desire to say, well, what happens when this goes wrong? What happens when this goes wrong? What happens when this goes wrong? And let's work out every possibility. I think it was especially done by product managers, and I think some of that was a result of product managers jockeying for position. There was very much this political element of the organization where I need to prove that I'm best or I'm doing the most. Again, there's that history of individual assignments and work and lots of stakeholders and lots of products. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend following this approach exactly. KY, do you have something you want to say? If you do, you're on mute.
How do you manage your design and your testing?
The design of the
product.
Of the product and the testing. I'll get to that a little bit later. If I don't answer it, please raise that question again. When we talk about what happens outside of the FAST meeting, I'll talk about that sort of stuff.
Also about the testing. Sorry, I asked you two questions. Just curious.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
All right. Thank you.
And when you say design, are you talking about software design, or are you talking about like user experience design?
Software.
Yeah. We'll get to that.
Thank you.
So I want to zoom in on this business priorities section of the board. But again, like I was saying, I wouldn't necessarily follow this as written. So on the left-hand side, we have whatever was completed in the last cycle, that I would keep. Then there was this wrapping up section. And the reason for that was that after work was finished from an engineering perspective, there was a certain amount of work to do with the stakeholders that the product managers would do. And the product managers kind of held themselves apart from the rest of the teams. They were special. Now that's partly because I think they wanted to be superior, and partly because there was a legitimate need for them, because there was such a strong amount of domain expertise required. There was a need for product managers to stick with certain stakeholders and really understand that stakeholders' set of medical questions and problems and clinician responsibilities. But I would not keep that wrapping up box. I would just say it's either in progress or it's done. There's no in progress and then mostly done and then done. You'll see that in the in progress box, we had about 8 slots available for people to choose from. In the beginning, all those slots were used, and then over time, they started to get better at not having a lot of work in progress. But I would still cut down the amount of work in progress. I prefer to only have 1 or 2 things in progress if possible. There was also a section for what's on deck, what's ready to start when there's a space available. I would keep that, but maybe not have as many things queued up unless they're really small, but they were really small in this organization. There was a section for things that were blocked, but in my mind, if you've got a lot of stuff that has the potential to be blocked, so much so that you need us to mark it on the board, it means that your team doesn't really have ownership of its work. It's depending on somebody outside the team to get stuff done. But one of the ideas with FAST is you can bring those folks into the team. So I prefer that. Now in this organization, the reason things would get blocked is because they'd have to go talk to stakeholders and get feedback. So it was legitimate for their needs, but it's not something I would start with by default. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I hear you on the block part, but wouldn't that be a good input to the FAST meeting, like as a kind of an artifact to bring up when you reorganize? Or I guess you just kind of answered the question because, yeah, sorry, because you mentioned another category of block just now, right? Or did I just miss that?
So yeah, when something gets blocked is because the FAST tribe can't work on it anymore. And yeah, everybody who was working on that would go reorganize to other things. And then when it's unblocked, they would come back and work on it again. So right. Yeah, that is mentioned. The reason I'm putting it X'd out is because I'd like things to not be blockable at all.
Right. Okay. Okay. But they would, I guess it would be top of mind enough that they would know to talk about it at the FAST reorg, I guess, the FAST meeting, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or okay. Okay. Got it.
For this organization, having the blocked segment made sense because they had a relationship with their stakeholders that resulted in things getting blocked. In another organization, I wouldn't start from the assumption that things will get blocked. I'd say, let's bring the authority to solve problems into the team so we just don't get blocked at all.
Okay, got it.
Does that
okay,
clarify?
Great. Yes, 100%. Thank you.
So it's not about not acknowledging things that can get blocked. It's about not having the possibility to block in the first place.
Gotcha. Okay, got it. Yeah.
Nice. They also had this whole section for things that are being prepped. Again, that's because the product managers sort of held themselves apart. So they would go off and but legitimately, they would go off and they talk to stakeholders. Then it might be a couple of weeks before they got a response back. And so they had this being prepped section for stuff that wasn't really ready to start engineering work. But again, I'd prefer not to have that if possible. And then we already talked about the small maintenance. I'd rather not have that too. So every team will need to customize FAST. So I'm not saying that what they were doing was wrong. What I'm saying is, if you're looking for an example to start from, don't start with the complicated thing that they ended up with, start with something simple. And this is what I've got on the screen right now is, if you're going to try FAST, this is what I would start with as my starting point. Just complete, in progress, and what's going to happen next. And then for the teams, just what the team's going to work on, the team steward, and the people who are on the team. And then whatever number of teams that you need for the number of people you have. I would suggest one team for every 4 engineers as a starting point. So you're probably wondering how team switching worked in practice. And I talked about the diagram I was going to show. And that's what this diagram is here. So I've got 2 months here of history of how people changed between teams. Each row is a single FAST meeting, and each column is a through line of work. So for each column, you're seeing this is the teams are working on more or less the same thing. And then the black lines show how people moved between teams voluntarily. Now I say voluntarily because there were people leaving teams because they were going on vacation, or because they were on call for ops, and that's sort of an involuntary movement off of teams and back onto teams. And I didn't diagram that out because it would have made the diagram messy, and also would have killed me because this was really hard to put together as it was. So I left that out. But it's still, I think, enough for you to get an idea of how people moved around. So what you're going to see is that in the first 4 weeks, or not the first 4 weeks, the first 4 fast meetings, which is the first 2 weeks, you're seeing a lot of movement here, a lot of people moving around. And what's happening here is that they're sort of figuring out who they want to work with, what they want to work on. Because remember, everybody was siloed. People had no idea what else was going on in the organization, no idea how this stuff works. So they sort of were moving around to figure that out. But then they settled in. And over the time, people started moving more just in response to the needs. When something was finished, like you see in the green check marks, they would move on to other things. When something was blocked, which is the red circles and the yellow caution icons, they would move on to things. When new things were started, they move on to those teams to start those work. Same for when things got unblocked. And you'll also notice that they started getting some really good throughput. They're delivering pretty much every couple of days now, something is being released. And when I say released, I mean released to customers. It's actually going out the door. So yeah, that's what it would look like when people were moving around. You can see here this sort of towards the end. Now this isn't all the data I have, but it's a lot of work. So that's where I stopped. But what you can see here is that there would be a little bit of moving around just because people were either needed on another team, or they were interested in moving to another thing, or there was no need for them on the team they were at now. But most of the movement is because a team's finished, and so they have to find something new to do. And this is interesting here. This is basically an entire team choosing to work on something new as well, with just one person joining who was on vacation prior to that. So I'm going to pause again and ask if there's any additional questions. Now that you've seen how this has worked in practice, does this raise any additional questions for you? Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, looking at this, fascinating. Looking at this, obviously you can't show this, but in your opinion or your observation, were people moving, as I think this is designed to be, as they saw fit to move somewhere? Did they feel pressure to move somewhere? Were there other factors, or do you think that all kind of sorted itself out? Does that make sense?
It very much sorted itself out. In fact, I was really surprised at how quickly it started becoming just very smooth and fluid. The first couple of weeks, there was a lot of movement because people didn't know what they wanted to work on, and there were a lot of personality conflicts in the organization. But those sort of shook out, and now what you see just a couple months later, people are moving pretty much because there's a real genuine need to move, not because, and that they're recognizing for themselves. And there was no pressure by anyone that you need to be on this team. And that's something that those of us on the change team, emphasized really strongly with management and executives. And they followed through on that. Does that answer your question, Jim?
Yeah, and by the way, Sherry has asked, she probably doesn't have any audio. She had a question, what do the yellow caution symbols mean? So I'm asking on her behalf.
Yeah, that refers to items that are blocked, waiting on stakeholder response or something else that's outside of the control of the team.
Thank you.
There's one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kamini.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, James, this was a very good. I can understand how much of effort it is to put this together, but that was a very good representation. So one question I had was just putting it in the reality, like, for example, I understand it's not for the entire organization, looking at large organizations. For example, we call it town, neighborhoods, and teams, and you said it's a tribe or a division which you try to work on. So in this typical example, which you showed, like, every 3 days or 2 days, you had this fast meetings and you kind of reorganized. How many product managers? I understand this is organized by the team stewards, But from a product vision or from a goal perspective, how is it organized at that level? Like how many product managers were there to prioritize this, or how many product goals were there? So that's a question. And the realistic problem we all face is taking the work to people rather than bringing people to the work. That's why these silos are creating a lot of problems. The question was more around how did you handle the resourcing issues? Because
sorry, I'm not understanding the question. Could you state it in another way?
Yeah, so two questions here. One is like the flow of work which you're showing, how many product managers kind of were there to help prioritize the work, or product goal was there? Because these are slices of work which I believe is part of a small team or a tribe or a division which you worked out of a large organization. So just trying to understand that slice of work from a product perspective. Was it like a couple of product managers owning that product goal and stewards helping to slice the work?
Yeah, so let me answer that question first. So product management was a really big chunk of work for us, and it's not something I'm really talking about here. They had a real problem with prioritization because they had so much stuff, so many stakeholders, and figuring that out was a big challenge. But it wasn't really a fast related challenge. It was just something that they had to do because of the nature of their organization. What we ended up doing was, so the division was fairly independent, but it had stakeholders that were in other parts of the organization. The executives, there were 5 executives for this division. It was a little bit top heavy. The executives each had different sort of sponsors that they worked with in different parts of the organization. And the division's boss worked with his boss to say, of these sponsors, what percentage of our time does each sponsor get? And then the product managers were responsible for looking at each of those sponsor areas, figuring out which things were most valuable for those sponsors, and coming up with these valuable increments, the pink stickies, that the organization could work on. Those were taken to the executives, who went through a prioritization exercise to say, this is what we're going to work on first. And that ultimately filtered down to, at the FAST meeting, saying, this is what's next. Does that answer your question, Yamin?
Yeah, that helps. So yeah, because there's a lot of prep and prioritization which has to happen at different levels before they even get to this. That's the concept I wanted to understand, but that helps. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, there is absolutely a level outside of what you see in the FAST meeting of figuring out what needs to be done.
Yeah, the prior.
Yeah, and that in this organization was done almost entirely by the product managers. I think in a more agile organization, there could be more involvement from senior members of the team, regardless of what title they had. But here was something the product managers felt they needed to hold very strongly to themselves.
Okay, thank you.
So James, there are a few questions, but I wanted to do a quick time check. It says 8:06, and I want to make sure that you go through your material, and then we organize around the material the ensuing questions.
Yeah, no, I think we're doing great. My understanding is we're done at 8:30.
Yeah. We will have time.
Yeah, I have about 45 minutes of content in total, and I was expecting a lot of questions, so we're still good.
Okay, so would you take the questions now?
Yeah, I'll manage it.
Very well. So Mina, you're next.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great presentation, insights. I haven't really, we don't work in this model, so I was just fascinated. Sounds a little complex, the whole self-organizing, but again, can you, especially in the virtual world now, what are the other tools besides Miro that you're sharing here, which actually help bring everything together, like making the work visible, providing some information radiators on the progress for senior management, and of course the self-organizing?
Yeah, they previously used Azure DevOps as their ticketing system. which they continue to use, but kind of got in the way. And they used Microsoft Teams, which is a steaming pile of garbage for their video conferencing. I hated it, but that's what they used. As for the information radiator, I'm going to get to that next. So hold on, and I'll get to that one.
All right, thank you.
Bernadette, go ahead.
Hi, I'm curious about the stewards. Did people take turns being stewards, or did it tend to be the same people who were stewards most of the time?
That's a good question. For one team, it was pretty much the same steward every time. For another team, I know that it was the same steward for a while, and then there was a moment at which, like, they sort of peer supported another person to be the steward the next time. So it was that team had a really healthy dynamic, and they sort of like encouraged somebody to take the stewardship role. I haven't analyzed other than those anecdotes, I haven't analyzed the data any more deeply than that.
Thanks.
I think I've got time for one more question, then I'm going to move on. So Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah. So there is a Sherry. Would you like to ask the question, or?
I will ask for Sherry. So it's actually related. So Sherry wants to know the difference between the green check and the thumbs up, and I want to know what the skull means.
Yeah. So the green check means that the valuable increment, the feature, was finished and delivered to production. The thumbs up means that something was blocked and is now ready to continue to resume work. And the skull means that the valuable increment was abandoned.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about what happens after. Oh no, I want to sort of briefly summarize what we saw from the fast self-selection. So this was kind of the worst case scenario for fast, in that we had siloed developers, lots of unrelated products. There was no team level coaching. It was a pretty challenging environment. But despite that, the fast process, the self-selection, which is sort of the majority of what fast is, that worked really well. Now, we had done about 6 months of change management prior to starting fast, but once we started it, it was really easy to adopt. They sort of got into it and were going smoothly after 2 weeks. Fast itself, the fast meeting is very low overhead. It was just 20 minutes twice a week. And it worked. I mean, people were fluidly allocating themselves. It solved exactly the problem we set out to solve, which is that we've got all these different things, and we need to make sure that the right people are working on the right things at the right time. And that 100% worked. So I was really impressed with how well fast itself functioned. There were a couple of things that didn't work well. People felt a lot of pressure to deliver every couple of days. And I think that's because of their history of, you are signing up for an iteration or a sprint, you're going to commit and you're going to deliver, because of their sort of strong product management is in charge of the engineers, and the product managers are going to tell you what to do and you're going to get it done. History, I think that there was some baggage being carried over from that. There was also a lot of difficulty for people ramping up on work that they weren't familiar with, which was everything except their silo. And they were not used to working in teams. Management was not ready to manage team dynamics at all. They actually had very little in the way of team level management. And there wasn't a lot of support for the teams. Also, there was no budget for on-the-ground coaching. I provided some high-level training, and then it was sort of go figure it out for yourselves. I would have preferred to do some coaching, more in-depth coaching, but that wasn't an option in this case. So these things that didn't work well, I don't think that they're endemic to fast. They feel like they are a consequence of the organization that I was working with, rather than a problem with fast itself. And even with these problems, fast still worked the way it was supposed to. So I was very impressed with it. Now, after the fast meeting, each team is free to work however they like. Even though it was challenging, because there wasn't that team level coaching, there wasn't the management experience with managing team dynamics, it still worked out. But there was some stress and some turnover that might have been preventable. There's 2 people I know who had got into a really big personality conflict. Managers chose a winner, the loser left, and then the winner left a couple weeks later. So that wasn't great. I think this was really all about moving to team-based work rather than FAST itself. FAST might have helped because people could move away from the folks that they had personality conflicts with. It might have hurt because teams weren't stable and they weren't able to go through the sort of normal team forming, norming, Tuckman cycle of forming, norming, storming, performing. But on the other hand, what I see with team self-selection in other organizations and also with FAST is that it allows you to short circuit some of the team dynamics and actually get to more of a norming stage much quicker because people are choosing to work together. So I'm not sure that this was really a detriment, but jury's still out on that point. Additionally, original FAST used mobbing, and there was no appetite for that here. So that might have helped, but we didn't get to try it. Now, FAST teams track their work using something called discovery trees. And this is an information radiator. I think Yamini is the one who mentioned, or maybe it was Mina who mentioned information radiators before. But discovery trees are the information radiator that FAST uses. It's basically a hierarchical outline. So you've got an outline. If I'm going to get ready for work, I'm going to wake up, get presentable, eat breakfast, and it's hierarchical in that get presentable involves brushing my teeth, taking a shower, getting dressed, making coffee involves measuring the beans, grinding the beans, and so on. So the discovery tree is just taking this outline and turning it sideways, putting it on stickies, and doing it just in time. So the way this works is you make the first level of the discovery tree. In order to get ready for work, I need to do this, this, and this. And then when you start working, you turn that sticky yellow in Miro, and you mark it with an icon representing you. I am working on this thing, waking up in this example. And then when it's done, you mark it green, and you move your icon to the next thing that you're going to work on and mark that one. If something is more than a couple of hours of work, then you're going to break it down into the next level of the outline. So to get presentable, we're going to brush teeth, take shower, and get dressed. Start working on one of those, mark it yellow. When that's done, move to the next thing, mark it green, and so forth. And then when the entire subtree is done, we can mark the parent task done, and we erase the subtree, because this is an information radiator about what's going on right now. And this is also the progress bar I referred to earlier. We're about 2/3 of the way done with getting ready for work. They're not necessarily all the same size, but it gives us sort of a rough sense of what's left to be done. And this continues for each piece of the work until everything is done. And once it's all done, you erase it and you make something new. This discovery tree makes a lot of sense to me, did not make sense at all to the people I was working with. And I'm not sure why that is. Now, the advantage of it is it's a nice lightweight way of seeing what's going on. And you have this ability to see what each person is working on. But there was a lot of confusion in the organization about how to use these discovery trees. People were used to defining their work in terms of days or weeks of work. So they had a lot of trouble breaking down into these small tasks. There was this sort of individualistic approach in the organization where people seemed to feel a need to record their accomplishments. So they didn't want to delete stuff that was done. They also had trouble making tasks that were sort of standalone tasks. So they would build out the tree and then they would assign themselves to a bunch of different tasks all at the same time. And they would tend not to work together. They were still used to working really individually. And they wanted to build the entire discovery tree from the beginning. And there was also confusion about what to put in the discovery tree versus the issue tracker. The guidance I provided was the discovery tree is for providing a radiator, information radiator about what's going on right now. And the issue tracker is for recording history that somebody's going to want to look at later. And I think that eventually did end up being, and you can take a, and I said, you can take a screenshot of the discovery tree and put it in the issue tracker if you think that would be useful history for somebody to have. And I think that did end up sticking, but it was definitely a challenge for folks. So I don't know that, I see your hand, Nancy. I don't know that discovery trees work. They certainly didn't work great here. And I have other techniques I use for providing information raters and sort of planning out tasks that I have had success with in the past. That said, we didn't have the team level coaching and there were other issues in this organization. So I'm going to try it again, at least one more time, probably a couple more times. And if it continues to not work, then out with the discovery trees. Interestingly, I talked to Ron Cortell, who created FAST, about his experiences with discovery trees. And he told me he had some of the same experiences. So they may not be a good idea. Nancy, go ahead.
I'm just curious, generally speaking, do you think most of the people who were involved in this will choose to continue using FAST? I'm wondering, did they make it their own?
I don't know. We established prior to me leaving that the monthly retrospective cycle, it was longer than you might be used to because we're talking about a retrospective with 40 people, and that's sort of a big deal. It's a lot of work. It was going to be every 2 weeks, but they switched it to being every month. And in the outcome of each retrospective was meant to be an experiment, and that experiment could be anything. One experiment was increasing the length of the cycles, but it could also be abandoning FAST. So they did start making it their own, and that they were conducting retrospectives and doing these experiments. But I know that there was still some anxiety about some of the things that I've mentioned that were a downside. I have plans to meet with one of the executives there again in September. This one was part of the change team who's very hands-on, and I'm going to learn where they're at that time. But I wouldn't say that it was unequivocal success from their perspective.
Thank you.
But again, I think, having sat in on those retrospectives and seeing the things that were bothering them, they were much more about going from individual work to working in a team than the actual FAST process itself. So I think if they did abandon FAST, it would be because of the stress of having to do team-based work rather than individual work. So to wrap up, FAST is a tribe of people who self-organize into teams on a frequent cadence. I think it's really promising. Even though this organization was, again, probably the worst case scenario for FAST, FAST itself worked really well. Again, they had trouble with team-based work. They had some challenges around the nature of their organization, but FAST solved the problems that it was meant to solve. They did start delivering. They moved from delivering very infrequently to, as you saw in that diagram, delivering every couple of days, something every couple of days. And they were able to react very smoothly to changes in priorities, which came in all the time. And that's what we were aiming to solve. It was also easy to incorporate specialties such as a user experience. If there was a team that needed a lot of user experience work, then the user experience engineers would just go work on that team. Very responsive to changing business needs, as I mentioned. That said, we saw some problems with collective ownership. That's confounded a little bit by the nature of the organization. But I think if you're going to try this for yourself, you're going to want to pay attention to collective ownership. And similarly, you're going to want to pay attention to team dynamics. Jury's out for me on whether the team dynamics issues I was seeing was organizational or something that's inherent to FAST itself. Looks like there's a question in the chat from Bob. Looking back and knowing that what you know now about this company, what might you have done differently? That's an interesting question. I think what they needed was team level coaching, and they needed management coaching about how to create collaborative teams. but there was no appetite for either of those things. So if I could go back and do it differently, I would give them a bucket of money to go spend on those things or to hire for those things, but that's not really realistic. Yamini, go ahead.
Thanks for this, James. So one thing I was thinking through is, how do you celebrate success? For example, in Waterfall, we do individuals, but when it comes to Scrum or Safe, it's more of a team success. But in this model, when we talk like 40 to 50 engineers working together, because that's an important component when we introduce all these methods, right? To keep the developers motivated. How do you celebrate success and accomplishments of?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Originally, right at the beginning, when the first team finished their first valuable increment, there was sort of a yay, congratulations, you finished your first increment. And then the next time somebody finished an increment, there was the same thing, yay, congratulations, you finished it, you just shipped, that's great. And then we got feedback in privately through sort of the back channels we had set up in the change team, because the change team were representing the organization, and there were sort of, we created the change team by asking people, who do you trust to represent you? So we got feedback through the back channels, and we conducted a survey to confirm it, that they didn't like the celebrations, which I think sort of speaks to the issues in the organization, because the celebrations were making the other people look bad in their mind. They did not have this, we're all in this together mindset. It's not we're celebrating together, it's these people won and we haven't won yet, and that makes us look bad. So so we stopped doing them. We sent out a survey, we're getting this feedback, what do you think, should we stop doing the celebrations? Answers came back, yes, you should stop doing the celebrations. So we did. So that's not a great answer, but that's what happened.
More on accomplishments as well, right? That keeps people motivated. Yes, celebration is part of it, but how do I feel accomplished? So that's always a question which keeps coming up in organization. And I'm sorry if I'm asking one more. How do you upskill or cross?
Let me answer one at a time, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the sense of accomplishment, I think, did come quite regularly from shipping. They were shipping quite frequently, but there was not there was no overt recognition of accomplishment. We actually specifically stopped doing that because of this sort of difficulty feeling like they're part of the team.
Thank you. The other thing, I think you said 4 days you do the work, and the 5th day is for development activities. Is that what you meant in this model? Because I'm asking this because if we continuously churn work around, when are the people getting their time to upskill them, right? To improve upon, to take new challenges. Because I'm not sure within the team they get the time for improvement. So
no, that's not true. So we worked in two-day cycles every week. And the 5th day was for meetings and sharpen the saw. Meetings were done in the morning and sharpen the saw was done in the afternoon. And sharpen the saw time was for arbitrary upskilling. The plan, I don't know if this happened, but the plan was to provide some courses during that time, but also allow people to pursue work on their own. But the other thing that happened is that if somebody wanted to stretch their wings a little bit, they'd just join a team that was doing stuff they wanted to learn. So there were lots of opportunities for people to stretch their skills. And I would say it was actually the opposite, because everybody had been in silos. There was a lot of learning that had to happen in the early days that was uncomfortable for people as they sort of learned parts of the system that they weren't familiar with.
Thanks, James. That was a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, a little bit more. So what would I do next? I've been describing a specific experiment, and I am not sugarcoating it. I'm sharing warts and all. Some things worked well, some things didn't work well. Would I do it again with this organization? absolutely, I would do it again with this organization because it solved the problems they were facing, and it solved them well. Did it solve everything? No. And did it introduce new problems? Yes. But I think where they ended up is better than where they were prior. When I get the opportunity to try FAST again, and I'm hoping to have that opportunity soon, I'm going to, now that I know that this works, it's something that I can recommend more easily. So in this organization, we started out assuming it was going to be sort of a classic scaling approach using the horizontal team topology style scaling. And so we did kind of a big bang approach. But for my next one, I can take an incremental approach. And the way I would do that, if I could do it anyway, and of course, everything has to be customized to the organization. And I see your hand, Jim, and I'll get to you in a moment. As I would start out by just teaching extreme programming to a team, I would say that the thing that the organization I'm talking about struggled with the most was not having really the team level collaboration skills that they needed. So I'd start out by teaching extreme programming and all the engineering and collaboration skills that go along with extreme programming. And once those skills were solid, I would merge with another team and we'd assimilate them. We'd teach the skills to that combined team. And once the team gets big enough, once the tribe is big enough, you can assimilate more teams and they get Borgified because you end up just working in the way the people around you are working. So that could start to accelerate. And I would continue that until it was too big or we had no more need to grow. If there were a lot of people in the organization, then that could be repeated to form multiple stream-aligned FAST teams. So that first organization I talked about with the 40 teams, 300 developers, we could have had 6 50-person FAST tribes. And I think a lot of their product management issues would have gone away and a lot of their cross-team coordination issues would have gone away. I think it would have been a big improvement if I'd known about FAST at the time. So that's what I plan on doing next. Let me take one last question for Jim, and then I'm going to close.
You may have answered it, but I was puzzled by why extreme programming was the basis. But is it that you want them to know pair programming and test-driven development and the discipline of it? Is that the general idea?
Yeah, and also if you're going to have this many people working together, you need to have the ability to do collective code ownership, refactoring, evolutionary design, and so forth. I think they would have benefited from those skills.
Gotcha.
Okay, well, that is FAST. It is a way to scale to larger teams by using self-selection. It is the most promising approach to scaling I've yet seen, and I encourage you to give it a try. That's it for me. Thanks very much.